Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Peternick, and today my guests and I will be speaking about a topic that's been debated across America these days quite a bit. It's a topic we're broadly defining as free speech in schools. I say broadly defined because it's not just about what teachers and students have a right to say in class or on their t-shirts or on social media. It's about what books students should have access to, what teachers and students can and should be able to talk about with each other in the classroom, where people can feel safe doing that, especially when it comes to politics, current events, and controversial topics. I was listening recently to a board meeting in Ohio, and an angry parent stood up and said to his elected board officials, actually, he didn't say it, he sort of yelled it, but he said that teachers should just teach the prescribed curriculum, he said, and nothing more. And that, of course, raises the question, is should part of the curriculum be focused on enabling students to have conversations with each other about issues they might disagree about? Or is that not in the curriculum? If it is in the curriculum, then teachers doing that would be, in fact, teaching the curriculum. So, but I have to, add something about what's happening in many states across the country, and that is the teachers in states like Florida have adopted new, often vaguely stated laws that prohibit teachers from discussing things like gender or sexual identity with their students. And several states also now prohibit teachers from discussing divisive concepts. That's the way it's written into law, or anything that would cause students to feel, quote, discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex. Teachers can, in fact, be fired or lose their credential if they cross any of those fuzzy lines in states that have adopted those kinds of policies. Well, before we dive into this really important and interesting subject, I would like you to meet our guests. Libby, I'm going to start with you. Tell our audience about you.
My name is Libby Snowden. I'm a senior at Yale, and I'm most recently from Norfolk, Virginia, but I grew up moving all around the country.
And you were a high school student where?
In Norfolk.
Okay, terrific. Sophia, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Sophia Rosenfeld. I live in Philadelphia, and I teach history at the University of Pennsylvania.
That's great. And finally, we're going to come to you, Deborah.
Hi, my name is Deborah Appleman. I teach at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. I live in the Twin Cities, and I also have been teaching for the past 17 years at a high security prison for men.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining Courageous Conversations. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on the topic today about free speech in school. So I just want to start with a general question to all of you, for all of you, which is, how should speech be limited in public schools? And Sophia, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I'm happy to dive in. And of course, the answer to the question depends a little bit whether we mean schools, we mean kindergarten, high school, higher ed. The rules are going to be a little different. And I assume we're talking mainly about public institutions rather than private ones, because of course that difference is important as well. If we're talking about K-12 public schools, certainly the First Amendment pertains, but in a limited way. I mean, to my mind, teachers should encourage the broadest possible array of conversations among their students. Young people are curious and want to know about a lot of things in the world, from current events to themselves and their own communities and families. And part of what a teacher's supposed to do is open up new perspectives. And I think that's true whether we're talking about small children or college students. That said, obviously, schools are not the same as the public sphere. Courts have always allowed for limits in speech in schools that are quite different from in the broader society. And teachers have some reason to be careful about what's age appropriate always for their pupils. I think that's important. You don't have the same conversations in the same ways with 10-year-olds as with 20-year-olds. But that said, as much as possible, wide latitude for speech is essential to growing up and to discovering the world.
Well, thank you for that. And I know we'll come back and have you and others weigh in on sort of specific situations that can arise where, what's age appropriate for some, it's not age appropriate in the minds of others. So it gets a little tricky, but we'll come back and sort of dive into some of the specifics. Libby, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question. How should speech be limited in public schools?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with everything Sophia had to say. I think you learn a lot, not just simply from, the lessons in the curriculum day to day, but from the conversations that you get to engage in with your peers, with your teachers, the new perspectives you get to learn about in class. And so I think having a wide latitude for speech on campuses in high schools is really important. But I think there are very important conversations to be had about age appropriateness, depending on what level of schooling we're talking about. The conversations you're having in a second grade classroom are necessarily going to be very different than the conversations that you'll be having in a 12th grade classroom. So I'm really interested to see sort of where this conversation goes and how we talk about those differences.
Terrific. And finally, Deborah, your thoughts on the same question.
I agree with what's been said, but I would also say that if we don't teach how to express ourselves in the second grade, it's going to be difficult for students to do it in the 12th grade. So I think that even though the point that Sophia makes about developmental appropriateness of content is important for teachers to think about, I think that we need to think about a kind of spiral curriculum of freedom of expression concomitant with civility. Because I think one of the things that I see is if students don't learn how to do that, it's not part of the curriculum. To me, it is the curriculum. If students don't learn how to do it early on, then no wonder they have issues expressing themselves freely and with civility when they're in high school and college. So I don't think it's ever too early to teach kids, number one, to speak their mind, and two, to not hurt people when they're doing it. So to me, starting early is a very important thing to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you added the important part at the end there about civility and respect, how to disagree, but in a courteous and considerate manner that treats the other person as an equal is something you can learn as a very young child, I think. And I find that even college students often haven't learned that, in part because they say they've been in very homogeneous environments often, in which, and that can go across the political spectrum, across race, class, but they haven't had the experience really that you're talking about of learning from a young age how to have those kinds of conversations. And college is a little late to be learning that.
One of the things I hear from educators these days, and I've heard it from students too, is that they sometimes don't feel safe expressing points of view that they don't think would be that the teacher subscribes to or others in the class. And I've heard of something that might actually qualify as bullying when, say, a conservative leaning student in a high school class expresses a conservative perspective and other kids, laugh at it or make fun of the person or critical in some way, but not in a very civil way. And I think students sometimes feel that they have permission to do that because it may be the prevailing point of view in a particular class. And so those students often say, I just keep my thoughts to myself. And I'm just wondering what you think about that, what you would advise a teacher to do, and whether you think it's a job of a teacher to intervene in cases like that to ensure that all kids, regardless of their point of view, feel safe in sharing their perspective. Libby, you're the most recent high school graduate, but you're actually in college at Yale now. And I just wonder if any of that, what I just said, resonates for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I can think of situations in high school where somebody expressed a viewpoint in class, and even if it wasn't maybe pounced on in the moment, there was chatter in the hallways, there were social media posts, word would get around. And I definitely think it is the responsibility of the teacher to sort of set the expectations and set the ground rules. I've been really lucky. I had a professor last semester, actually, in a political science course who first day of class said from the outset, if you hear something you disagree with or something that you find on its face is offensive, don't go straight for attacking the person who said it. Probe further, ask, why do you think that? Where did you learn that information? Where is this coming from? And having an open mind, and assuming good faith, not bad faith, and learning to question rather than go on the defensive. I think if the teacher can explain from the beginning that that is the goal and that is the expectation, and even model that questioning him or herself, I think that would go a really long way in encouraging healthy dialogues where people disagree and can really get to the nuance and the nitty-gritty of the issues at hand.
I would like to think that if some of the lawmakers who supported these bills that are now banning conversations about divisive concepts heard that and could be assured and that was taking place, maybe they would think differently about the need, as all of you said, for kids at a very early age to start having conversations around concepts that may be whatever divisive, I guess, if you substituted the word controversial or concepts where people might have a disagreement. It seems to me what all of you are saying is that those are healthy conversations. We want to help kids learn how to do it. Yeah. Sophia?
I might jump in to say this, though. I think those bills are pernicious because they, in part, don't make proper distinctions. So I teach history. It's impossible to teach history in a way that'll make sure nobody's ever feeling uncomfortable. I mean, slavery, for instance, is a fact of American history. If you leave it out of the curriculum, you've misrepresented our past. It's bound to make people feel uncomfortable to learn about the history of slavery. It should make people feel uncomfortable. That said, I don't follow up by saying, let's have a debate about the pros and cons of slavery. We might read the positions of slaveholders in order to try to understand how people conceptualize things in the 19th century and how different that is from today. But I don't ask the students, are you for or against? I mean, and that distinction is very important. There are many issues that we study in history that are not live debates today. And to suggest that there's some sort of translation between them is to misrepresent a lot of what teaching is about.
Yeah, I suppose what you're suggesting is that there are some issues that have been settled,
Exactly.
like slavery. I think too, if someone came in and says, well, I don't believe the Holocaust that you were teaching about really happened. As a teacher, is that something that you would allow them to investigate or to say, why do you think that? Or would you say that's been settled and we're not going to entertain that?
It's a great question, and it's a very important one. I think one has to have a very wide perspective, but one has to accept that certain questions are, in a sense, morally settled. We don't debate, for instance, questions of eugenics. We don't debate slavery as live questions. We study them only historically. And there are certain kinds of misinformation that we don't allow. So you don't have to talk about whether the earth is flat as a live issue, the same way you don't have to talk about, did the Holocaust happen? Because at this point in time, we consider those factually settled questions. There are many things that are not, but those are.
In a moment, I'm going to come back after I come to Deborah, because I want to tell you about a strategy a colleague of mine, an English teacher, does when students come and present an idea that he thinks is already settled. And I'm curious to know what you think about this strategy. But Deborah, your thoughts on this question?
Well, I think that one of the things that we need to trouble is, what does it mean to have a safe classroom? Because when in your introductory remarks, when you talked about, trying to avoid, or people trying to avoid discomfort, guilt, and anguish, I actually think that discomfort, guilt, and anguish are required for learning. You can't learn about the Holocaust or learn about slavery without feeling discomfort, guilt, and anguish. And I think that we don't necessarily want to make sure that students always feel safe if what their opinion is something that is, absolutely contrary to what we know is settled. We're going to create some intellectual disequilibrium. It's not our choice to protect them from that. It's actually our job to create it. So I think that on one hand, I believe in first do no harm. I don't want students to be bullied, but I do think, especially in a college like the college that I teach in, we sometimes fetishize, what does safety mean? What does it mean if you come out and people disagree with you? What does it mean if you get some social media posts? I understand that we need to protect students from self-harm, but I think actually that we don't want to keep them wrapped in a kind of protective bubble, so that what education is only looking in the mirror and having what you believe be reinforced. And if that isn't, that means that there are going to be moments of disconnection where your mind is going to be blown, and that doesn't feel comfortable, and that actually doesn't feel safe. And that's kind of what I'm going for. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just don't really think that, safety, I just think it needs to be nuanced a little bit.
I want to, so if you just mention one thing that I said I would ask you about, because I'm curious, and your take from all of you. This one teacher said occasionally students would come and raise something that they wanted to argue for that was essentially a settled issue. But rather than saying we're not going to do that, he essentially said the same thing you did, except he would allow the person to go off and do an independent study about that, write a paper, come back and present it, as long as it was supported with evidence and facts. And so there was an opportunity to say, if you still really believe that, I want to give you an opportunity to go study it and then come back to me. And if you support it reasonably well, then you can share it with the class. But it was just a way, he said, I didn't want students feeling that I had simply shut them down and there was no place for them to study it. And he said this way they could do it on their own, and occasionally they would. So I just wonder what you think about that.
It's actually a nice strategy. I like that idea. I mean, and the key word you just gave, I think, in that was evidence. So I rarely ask students, how do you feel about that? Because I'm not really interested in their sort of gut reactions to things or their prior politics. I'm really much more interested in, how did you come to that opinion? And is that based in lived experience or something you read or a particular text or an artifact? I mean, where is your evidence for anything you want to claim, including political positions? What set of values does this come from? And I think the reason to do that is partly to model how do you get to good assumptions about things, but the other is to make people kind of self-conscious about the process of how and why they know what they know. And I think we're teaching people simultaneously to be a little bit skeptical, because skepticism is part of being in a democratic society, to question everything, but simultaneously to know, how can you know things? When have you landed on good evidence? And I think that exercise you're presenting suggests an openness to skepticism, but also a willingness to suggest that some things are going to prove to not be true if you use proper methods to ascertain their value.
But I have a problem with that strategy, two problems with it. One is that in a way, it's not an authentic inquiry. If the teacher knows in their heart of hearts that what the person is trying to do is, let's say, prove that the world is flat or prove that the Holocaust didn't happen, then they're setting the student up on a fool's errand knowing that. And I actually think that's kind of pedagogical malpractice, because they know that what they're going to find, either they're not going to be able to find it because it's not true, or they're going to find, unfortunately today, sources that support their belief, because there are all of these incredible, unreliable sources that support all of these different preposterous points of view. So if there's really an open question, then you're including an opportunity for students to have authentic inquiry. But if it isn't, if it's settled, it's like, then in your heart of hearts that the student isn't going to find the answer that they want. And I'm not sure that I am in support of
that. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Libby, what are your thoughts about a teacher that would take an issue that the teacher thought was settled, but a student says, I disagree with you, and sends them off, as you know, Deborah said, on a fool's errand, knowing that they couldn't possibly come up with it. Is that worth doing?
I think it's an interesting exercise. I appreciate how Sophia framed it, talking about like forcing you to think about why do you believe what you believe? Where does that come from for you? And forcing you to sort of look for that evidence. But I also completely understand what Deborah's talking about. Like, the proliferation of conspiracy theories is unparalleled today with the internet. And, you know, you can go to the farthest reaches of the internet and find anything that you want to find that might end up reinforcing a lot of those beliefs. So I don't know. I think I have mixed feelings about it because I understand, I think both perspectives here. I think really the biggest, or maybe not biggest is the right word, but I think another really valuable aspect of that would be having a conversation with the student before or after the research takes place, just to really probe that as well.
Yeah, and Libby's point is a good one there. And I'm thinking through Deborah's critique, which is a very valid one. And there might be, my hesitation in taking that line was the idea that you would simply shut somebody down for having the wrong opinion. That said, some opinions are outside the realm of what we should be considering for real reasons. I guess I'm going to modify what I said by asking in some ways whether the person was asking a question in good faith and was in a sense open to the idea, I think this, but I need to know more, or whether the person was sort of a bad actor in a sense of deliberately, say, a person who's denies the Holocaust as a result of anti-Semitism is not somebody you want to be like, well, prove it to me. But a person who's simply heard the wrong thing and confused, and you want to give that person a chance, in a sense, to re-examine their beliefs and maybe discover, not just say you're wrong, but say go back and let's look, let's go to the library together, let's see what real books say on this topic, let's find out what vetted information. And an important thing about teaching these days, Libby's absolutely right, is to teach students what is legitimate information. It's no longer the case that kids just can go to the school library where everything's been vetted for them. They have access to every kind of wrong piece of information possible. And part of what we need to do is help them also identify not just as what is good evidence, but what is a good source.
Yeah, what a fascinating set of questions. And the teachers, for teachers to think about is, do I, and I appreciate what you said, Deborah, that sending them on a fool's errand, but I also, as an educator, think about, what I learned from John Dewey, talking about the importance of trying things out and failing and making mistakes, provided that what you said, Sophia, is true, that that they truly believe that there is evidence for something that is in fact a closed issue. But I sort of like the idea that a student could go off thinking that, I'm really quite sure the Holocaust didn't happen, and they go off and study it, and they come back and bring what they think is evidence, which of course wouldn't count as evidence because we know it's not true. But sitting down with them, as you said, Sophia, or maybe going into the library and say, let's consider the source. Again, we're talking about a student who genuinely believes it isn't just that you could walk through that. It could be life-changing for someone whose teacher didn't shame them for, once again, for having an unpopular view. They challenged them to go find evidence. And then when they brought the evidence in, worked with them to talk about what counts as acceptable evidence and what counts as something else that was simply made up. And a lot could be learned, again, if you had a student who genuinely, but Deborah, I want to just give you a chance to respond to all that, because I know you had a different point of view about that.
Right. And I mean, it's like you brought up John Dewey, and when we think about sort of experiential learning and discovery learning, the whole idea was you don't know what you don't know, and what you want to do is use the world to discover it. That's very different from having an a priori conclusion and using the world to prove it one way or another. So I think that's very different. And I think one of the problems that goes all the way back to free speech is that people have made these conclusions prematurely, that they believe what they believe and their minds are not open enough to really entertain two possibilities. So what we're talking about, and part of the challenge, is actually teaching closed-mindedness. And so that's one of the strategies that your teacher friend is trying to come up with. Somebody's mind is closed about something and he's trying to pry it open by having them use sources. But I don't really think that from a Deweyan perspective, that's what this exploration of the world was all about, that we've sort of lost the opportunity to have a beginner's mind, right? I mean, it's sort of like Mark Twain said a long time ago, you know, when I was like 18, I thought that my father was like a complete idiot. And by the time, you know, I was 21, I realized how much he had learned. I mean, and it's kind of really that youth is about closed-mindedness. So how do you know what you know? And why have you already come to this conclusion prematurely? So I think that that's part of the problem as well.
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the kind of materials, reading materials, and even movies and other media that students should have access to. And I guess it falls within this broadly defined category of free speech. But there was a teacher in Florida. Her name's Jenna Barbie. She was in the news, national news. She actually quit, but the reason she quit was she got a lot of pressure from people in her school district who had reported her to the state authorities because she showed the movie Strange World in her 5th grade class. It's a movie that has information about earth science. It's animated, related to her curriculum. And so this goes back to age appropriateness, Sophia, that you alluded to earlier. But the reason that she was reported to state authorities is that there was a gay animated character. I believe it was a male animated character that had a crush on another male character. And somehow, in the view of a board member whose child was in her class, this violated a state law, and it never actually was adjudicated because she quit, because she couldn't stand the pushback she was getting from the board member and others. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the removal of books that, just by virtue of the fact that they have LGBTQ characters or themes in them. Sophia, let's start with you.
That's a sort of an easy question. In a certain sense, we're in an incredibly censorious moment, and it's all very political. It's kind of a political theater of sorts, but it involves this idea, a kind of weaponization of the idea that teachers are exposing, and librarians too, are exposing children to sexually explicit materials, whether it's about trans children or LGBTQ themes, or anything that might be kind of weaponized to suggest that children are being introduced to woke ideas and therefore a whole slew of political values, and thus indoctrinated by schools rather than allowed to grow up according to some kind of traditional norms. And so I see the book bans as really a tool in a much larger political fight. And they worked successfully in a few places to encourage the idea that parents weren't being given rights to determine what their children saw or read. But they have the pernicious effect of limiting what children have access to, of making the appeal of the profession of teacher or school librarian limited in a moment in which you might find yourself under attack. And that's a real disservice nationally. And ultimately, they're kind of an attack on the idea that schools are places where children should be able to explore and grow and learn about things. I think there's very little evidence that reading a library book that has a gay character in it, or an animated movie with a gay character, is going to make anybody gay tomorrow. That doesn't seem to be how the sexuality works, but it's a very effective political tool.
And in fact, I would say for those kids who are gay, who have gay friends or parents, to see gay characters as sort of normalized is comforting and is an important
right.
And it's important for other people who may not have come to the conclusion that this is a normal and okay thing, and gay marriage is now the law of the land. Uh, if you don't see that, you never talk about it, then you're likely to learn that there's something wrong with it.
Absolutely. I mean, that certainly goes to the importance actually of a wide range of kinds of representation of peoples, types, professions. All kinds of people need to be introduced as among the varieties of ways humans exist in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Libby, your thoughts on this?
I think it's interesting, especially we talked about the laws in Florida in particular. A lot of the terms used in that legislation tend to be very broad and lead to a chilling effect in schools, which I think that's really the kind of more dangerous or pernicious aspect of these, where we have teachers who are afraid to bring up certain topics in class because they don't know what counts as divisive or inappropriate for the age group per se. And so I think that really speaks to the value of the local community, the school boards, having parents being involved there, and really having conversations between the school boards, the teachers, the parents, and even the students about what is being taught in classrooms and how do we talk about these topics. I mean, we have shifting cultural norms right now. It is becoming much more socially acceptable to have gay characters in children's movies, gay characters in books, and have those be more widely available. But we have to keep in mind that not everybody is sort of progressing on the same timeline. And so it's really important to engage with each other about how are we going to handle that in our schools. And every perspective, I think, matters to come to a conclusion that works best for most people.
I want to hear your thoughts, Deborah, and then I want to ask you a question about a different kind of book banning, a concern raised by a conservative writer named James Fishback in just a moment. But Deborah, your thoughts on what we've been discussing right now.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that even though I completely agree with Libby and Sophia about the pernicious effects of that particular kind of book banning, we have to realize that a lot of book banning lately has happened from the other side of the political spectrum. So I wrote a book called Literature in the New Culture Wars, and the first chapter is called Clowns to the Left of Me, Jokers to the Right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. I got started on this, for example, by the banning of Sherman Alexie in public school libraries all across the country. He's a writer that I really admire, that I appreciated teaching as a high school teacher. And it's not conservatives who are banning him. It's not conservatives who are taking J.K. Rowling, for the money. It's not conservative who have banned some LGBTQ young adult authors for certain kinds of things. There is a kind of wokeness test with a whole bunch of folks who believe that you have to bring the life of the author under a certain kind of moral scrutiny that kind of fits along with values that I believe in, values that I ascribe, and yet making a decision that those books should not be read by people or be in libraries. So that we find ourselves in this moment where we have this kind of legislation that's going on in Florida that's absolutely horrible. A teacher just got into trouble for teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. I mean, all of these kinds of things that we'd love to have conversation with kids about. But the conservatives have been joined by the liberals by thinking about who gets to say what books kids should read and why. And that's why I think we're in a particularly dangerous moment right now. And that may relate, Ken, to the counterexample that you might be offering of it's not just conservatives who are doing the censorship. It's other people as well.
So let me just,
if I can just jump in for one
Sure.
second. Deborah's absolutely right that both there are versions of this on both the right and the left at the moment, and both are to be challenged for sure. But when you ask specifically about state legislatures and the political process, the book banning is happening on the right as a political tool. The kind of the attack of, say, on Sherman Alexie is happening much more in a sort of abstract kind of social norms way, what we might call cancel culture or something like that in this, which is quite different than legislated bans on books. I just want to make that distinction clear.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fair. And that's a really important distinction.
So let me just share with our audience something that a conservative writer, James Fishback, stated in a recent piece. He says he's not for book banning at all, but he says a lot of the book banning that has taken place has been by liberals who have banned or essentially not included conservative authors in their libraries. And he points to people like books, by Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, that according to research he cites, and again, let's just assume that research is accurate, that you can find a lot more liberal authors when it comes to politics, Barack Obama and our current president, Joe Biden. But you have a really hard time in many public school libraries finding conservative authors. And I'm wondering, let's just assume for the sake of argument that is true. Is that something you're concerned about? Libby, what do you think that our libraries ought to contain a politically diverse set of materials for kids to read and so they can make their own minds up?
I think if there's going to be political themes and political books in the library in the first place, I do think that having the full spectrum is worthy. I think it's really important that students are able to explore different sections of the political spectrum to sort of not only understand maybe where they fall, but to understand the arguments of the other side. I mean, one of the beauties of free speech is, you get to not only figure out what you believe, but your opinions are strengthened when you're able to really wrestle with the opposing argument. You're able to really hone why you believe what you believe, and you're better able to engage with other people when you understand where they're coming from, especially in the political sphere. So I think having those options is really important. And also, not to mention that those ideas on the right, like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, those kinds of writers and thinkers, really have influenced like modern political and economic thought today. So it's really important to have an understanding of the way that those people thought to understand the world that you live in.
Thank you for that, Libby. Sophia, do you think our libraries ought to be, to the extent that they are populated with books about politics and history, should have a politically diverse representation?
As a general principle, absolutely. Libby's absolutely right that's how we learn, is by being exposed to a lot of things. But I'd be surprised about any high school library that was buying kind of hack, political memoirs, whether it was Gretchen Whitmer or Ron DeSantis. I can't really imagine that would be vital reading material for a high school library. So, I mean, if we're talking about public libraries in general, sure, they ought to represent a range of possibilities. But I can think of much more valuable reads in general. I mean, I think what we really need to do is trust educators and librarians to understand how to create valuable sets of books for the clientele that they have, their constituencies. I don't think that we want slanted, all this books or all that books. But there is a sense in which we've stopped trusting professionals in this matter to adjudicate for themselves what's valuable, because everybody feels they can be a good judge of these things in the world of social media.
Fishback's argument is that there are, he believes, progressive librarians who are sort of picking books that sort of fit their politics and not selecting books, that they're not acting as true professionals. And the evidence he gives is, they've gone in randomly and looked at in books and finds many more that are left-leaning than right-leaning. And I gather that if that's true, I think what I'm hearing you say is that there should be some balance.
But it really depends what that means, right-leaning or left-leaning. So if we're talking about simply books about politics written by political figures, yes. Though I don't think that's a very valuable category. If we're talking about social theorists, Libby mentioned some important social theorists, yes. But if we're saying sort of, should there be an equal number of books about how there's the climate change and climate denial? No, then librarians are correct to purchase books that correspond to what we take to be accurate information today. So I think it's hard to sort of say what's a left-leaning book and what's a right-leaning book as in the broadest sense, unless we're simply talking about people's political parties.
I'm just thinking about books that might be written from a political perspective on some issue, related to economics, as Libby mentioned, or historical perspective, or any number of other things, or even about education. They're conservative perspectives and they're liberal. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that if these are, credible authors that are citing evidence and have reasonable arguments, even if we don't in the end agree with them, the students should have access to those materials. And maybe I'm not
But
capturing.
they should be of a caliber that they've been vetted
Yeah,
by a combination of whether that's peer review, editors at major presses,
Yeah.
library associations. I mean, it doesn't mean everything goes. It's not, the library shouldn't be the equivalent of, say, your social media feed.
yeah. That's a terrific point. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to quickly say that in a way, I mean, it's worrying about something that's not worth worrying about, in the sense that, do we really think that most students get most of their information from the books in their school library? I mean, that's just yeah, we wish. I mean, it's just sort of similar to this idea. Nobody who has ever been a teacher thinks that they can effectively brainwash a student into believing something that they're not prone to believe. I mean, I wish in some ways that teachers were so effective that they would teach a lesson and the student would abandon everything that they believed and then adopt this new kind of orthodoxy and come home and tell their parents. Schools don't work that way. Kids don't learn that way. And so people are perseverating on these tiny little examples of bias that really are not part of what is in the educational fabric of what it means to learn in schools these days.
I interviewed someone, dean of, I think that's the dean of the College of Education at Wisconsin, Diana Hess, who wrote a book on politics in the classroom a number of years ago. And she actually did research with her colleagues that found that what you said, Deborah, is true, that students, by and large, don't feel that their teachers are trying to influence them. And even when they do, think that they know what the teacher's political perspective is. When asked if that influenced how they think, they said no.
No,
They
you can't even
generally,
influence kids to be quiet when somebody else is talking.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's true at the university level or college level as well, to a certain degree. I recently read, there's sort of claims. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, home of Wharton School. It's there's an active movement right now, sort of attacking the university as kind of very left-leaning place that's indoctrinating students. But if that were really true, then it's hard to understand why a higher percentage of students at Penn enter the financial services industry than any other university in the country. I mean, most students end up on Wall Street within a year of leaving. It doesn't sound like they've all become Marxists because they took a sociology class or something like that. I think students are smart and open-minded and don't just follow the winds to the degree that they're often portrayed as doing.
Exactly.
But Libby might have some interesting thoughts on this, being an active student. I can only report this from, my interactions with students in a different role.
Libby, at Yale, you get a sense that when you have people coming and visiting and speaking at Yale, that there's no limits on free speech. I mean, colleges, when I went to UC Berkeley at a time when free speech was the free speech movement during the Vietnam War, when people protested to make sure that people had an opportunity to speak freely at a time when it wasn't being allowed. But nowadays you have many liberals on campuses who are opposed to certain people coming and exercising their free speech on campuses. And a colleague of mine, Peter Coleman, who I've interviewed at Columbia, wrote a wonderful article recently saying that his campus, Columbia University, was rated at the bottom in terms of their tolerance for free speech, not just the speakers that they would allow to have, but in the classroom, what students said about how free they felt to express their own points of view. So, Libby, I'm just curious to know what your perspective is on that as the one person who's still a student in school.
Yeah, well, I will say I've been really lucky. I've gotten to be involved in an organization that's all about free speech and intellectual diversity on campus. And every week we host events that we bring in largely conservative speakers on an otherwise very liberal-minded campus. And we're really like, it's awesome. We have people come in and listen to the speaker and hear what they have to say. We don't get disrupted. When we have question and answer, we have respectful questions, even if they are challenging, they're asked in good faith. And then in the classroom as well, I think when you have one student who has the courage to speak their mind, even if it maybe goes against maybe the norm or the perceived norm, that goes a long way. It allows other people to feel confident that their voices and their view can be heard in good faith as well. So I do think that the climate is a lot better when you're actually on the ground and witnessing it for yourself than what you might see in the news. But it's been an interesting time to be on campus the last 4 years, to say the least.
Yeah, I'll bet. I'll bet. Any final thoughts from Sophia or Deborah?
My experience really matches Libby's here, is that students are much more able to cope with these questions than we generally give them credit for. Most students, you hear about the outliers, but most students are thoughtful, willing to hear different points of view. And even when they say sometimes they're nervous or a little scared about saying things, sometimes we think of that as a bad thing, but sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it means they're being cautious because they want to be careful in choosing their words well, in not offending other people, and trying to figure out how to state their opinions in ways that are respectful of their friends who might have different thoughts. And I think that's actually a mature response in some ways. It's not necessarily a bad thing when people feel cautious about how to articulate things that matter to them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that I admire my students tremendously, and I think that for the most part, they are able to have these kinds of civil, open conversations. I feel like right now we are really going to be put to the test with these principles because of the Israel-Gaza conflict. I think it's created a lot of polarization. I think it's a very, very, very difficult situation with a lot of nuance, and people are jumping to different sides, and it's so hard on both sides to articulate your position and beliefs without people filling in the blanks about you that aren't really quite true. So I'm hoping that all of this time that we have spent together as a civilization trying to encourage each other to be brave and to be kind and to be thoughtful and to be nuanced is going to come to fruition in the kinds of conversations that I think we have to have with each other, because honestly, as we know from our college campuses, some of them are not really going that well. So, I mean, I don't want to be Debbie Downer or anything like that, but I really feel like we're faced with a test of discourse right now, as much as with a political test. Libby, I wonder how you feel about that. If you think that this issue is one that is more fraught than others in your community and with your friends.
Sure. I mean, I will say, I think what's happened in the last 3-4 months has prompted some really important conversations about the crisis of free speech on college campuses. It's been something that's been murmured about in conservative circles, I think, for the last 5-10 years. But what's happened in the last 3-4 months has been national news. You can't ignore it. And so I really think it's bringing everybody to the table to talk about what is happening on campus and how are these students engaging with each other, and what does that mean for how our younger generations are going to engage with each other in the real world one day. Campus has definitely been pretty tense, but it's been really, really heartening to see people sit down and talk to each other. I've seen some really, really cool instances of that, where students have been saying, we crave a conversation, let's sit down and talk, rather than point fingers and shout at each other and call each other names, because that does happen. Not saying it's not there. it's prevalent. But there are more students than you think that are actually interested in having a real conversation with each other.
Libby, I'm going to let that be the last word. And I want to thank you, Libby, and Sophia and Deborah for being part of this episode of Courageous Conversations About Our Schools. I really created and decided to host this podcast for the very reasons that all of you just said. It's so important for us to have civil conversations where we listen to each other and approach it with a sense of curiosity. And I would just say my hope is that all of you out there listening to this, educators, students, parents, policymakers, embrace opportunities to talk about issues like free speech in schools, and that you do it like my guests did here today, with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to listen, and to show some empathy. And I just want people to remember that empathizing with one another, trying to understand why others might have different perspectives than us, is not an endorsement of their views. It's an attempt to understand. It's pretty amazing how others often become more willing to listen to us when we listen to them and show some empathy. I think the phrase I heard from Amanda Ripley is that we have to make ourselves hearable. And one way to do that is by hearing others and really listening to others. So with that, you can find this episode and all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org and on just about anywhere you get your podcasts. Bye, everyone.